Hey, let me stop it.
Recording.
This morning's interview is with poet John Roche. And welcome, John.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for hosting me.
Um, John and I have been talking about this interview for months and kind of trying to get a feel on it and for me to come up to speed on some of the topics that we're going to cover today. Uh, we've entitled this Beats and the Black Mountain Poets, and it's a lot to cover. So we're planning to do this in two parts, an hour and a half each. And this first part, we're going to start off with, first of all, let me go through a little bit about John's background. John lives on three high desert acres in the shadow of the Sandia Mountains in Placitas, New Mexico. And I'm reading out of the back of his second poet of the Joe Rides Again poetry book. Help, helping his wife, Jules Nyquist, run Jules Poetry Playhouse and edit Poetry Playhouse publications. John taught literature and creative writing classes for many years at the Rochester Institute of Technology and was formerly president of the Just Poets organization, a member of the board of BOA Editions, chief organizer of the Black Mountain North Symposium, and one of the instigators of the annual Cloudburst Council Poets Retreat. Among a number of other books, John and Jules have published the 5-volume Poets Speak anthology series, Trumped, Airs, Water, Walls, and Survival. John's own poetry collections include On Conesus, is that correct?
Kinesis.
Kinesis, Topicalities, Road Ghosts, and the Joe Poems, the continuing saga of Joe the Poet, and the latest one, which is Joe Rides Again. And I had heard John read from the books at various poetry readings, but I'm not real good with translating auditory poetry into anything that I can digest. So until I read the Joe Poems, I really couldn't say much as to comment much as to my own impression with them. After reading them, I would have to say this is the most original poetry I have read. And I'm saying that covering a span of 68 years, reading from Neruda, Whitman, Leopardi, Ginsberg. These books are the most original, and I'm not saying that to flatter John. They are orthogonal, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, complimentary sense. They are truly covering new ground. The simple device of Joe, this I would call him a cosmic hobo. Joe takes us all the way back thousands of years into the past. He takes us into the future. He takes us into dark alleys. He takes us into cliffs and volcanoes. And one of the really great things that I enjoyed about reading these is as you turn the page to the next poem, you don't know where you're going to end up. And the insights that are presented through this figure, Joe, I would say that this would be a great way to introduce college students to world history and literature, is to have them read these books and go through, and as they read through, discuss each of these poems, because it provides the most kaleidoscopic perspective of reality on this earth that I've encountered in poetry. And I'd have to say in fiction as well, although I've read some good fiction writers, they don't have the scope that's covered in the Joe poems. So that's my impression with them. I can go back to these books over and over and over again. And whether it's taking me back to the time of a Greek philosopher or into some foreign country and some particular event that occurred in France in the 1850s or whatever, It's so refreshing because it just breaks us free from all of these presuppositions about poetry and what poetry should be, or for that matter, what can be done with writing. So, congratulations, John. These are really an achievement.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm glad you enjoyed them. I love the idea of Joe as a cosmic hobo. I think that's a good phrase. And yeah, and you know, I have been trying, kaleidoscopic, I've been trying to do that. Sometimes it works better than others, but a kind of kaleidoscopic range or yeah. Um, Joe just appeared out of nowhere pretty much. I mean, I started quite frankly with a poem where there was a joke about Joe the plumber. Remember that
Right.
that right wing Joe the plumber guy, and then this other character appeared and you know, I'm not quite sure where it came from. With the advice of some friends, I did end up for the first book, especially with a 10 line, with what I call the Joey, 10 lines, less than 100 words, very stripped down syntax. With that kind of compression, I think helps. And it's also good for the reader because you can read them, you can read them pretty quickly. And
Yes.
then hopefully take a while to digest it before you go on. But the second book, I've been um, a little bit more flexible about the form. I still do some Joeys, but I also do some a little bit longer ones as well. So yeah, but I could read a few if you'd like.
Yeah, why don't we do this? If we could go to the first book
Yeah.
and give us some examples of, yeah, there you go, of the Joey style.
Yeah. I just wanted to, because of the two covers, I just wanted to credit a former student of mine, Whitney Grattan, who did these two covers. And this, of course, Monument Point, so there's kind of a Western theme. And this one, I don't know if you can make out, but it's a kind of a Martian scene with kind of Space Joe. So, but they're both by Whitney Grattan, who's a wonderful illustrator. So anyway, uh, I'm sorry, what were you saying about the first book?
Uh, if we could go to the first book and take a look at the style of the Joey poems
Yeah,
uh, with some readings from that.
okay. Uh, I'm going to skip over the longer epic prologue, and I'll start with the first actual poem, or the first 10-line poem in the book, which is called Joe the Poet in Montana. Joe, camping under big sky, reaches up and squeezes some star juice for his cowboy coffee, hums the little tune he learned back in his seafaring days, the one about Sir Patrick Spens. He learned it from his shipmate Sinbad. Then he composes a little ditty, the ballad of Skin the Goat. Joe takes off his boots and unpacks his bedroll, checks perimeter for rattlers, lies awake a century or two, just watching the blooming stars.
Now, I'm going to risk something here. I think maybe a lot of
Go
times
ahead.
it's best to avoid asking a poet what they were thinking at the time they created this and how they went through it. I know that for me, I used to very consciously contrive a poem. I would craft it, and then later, I just felt like whatever the inspiration came, I was going to follow that. So here, how did you approach writing this poem?
Well, I think these early ones, especially, I mean, it's true of a lot of my poems. A lot of my poems kind of come in the middle of the night or early morning, just, kind of come and I'll jot them down. I used to use a pad and paper. Now I'll often jot them on, sometimes I was using audio, tape recorders, and then more recently, a little note section on an iPhone. So I'll jot them down and then I'll so most of it comes, right away. then I will the process of retyping them in Word, and then the process. That's the kind of the editing process with trying to squeeze them, fit them into 10 lines, less than 100 words. So I guess the initial, but 90% of it's there right away, and it just, especially these early ones, they just came from where? Who knows? They just came, and then the process of revising as you're retyping helps give a little more shape to them. But 90% of it's there right from the get-go.
So kind of, if we could go back to that time when you wrote this. Um, First line, Joe camping under big sky. So
Yeah.
this image or this line comes to you,
And I
and
had, I did hitchhike through Montana, we're talking 40 years ago, but I do have that memory of camping with just a sleeping bag under the big sky. So, so I think that was an actual memory that got in there.
now at the time that the line occurs to you, do you know where this poem's going to go in the end, or what it's going to?
No, not really. Um, because especially at this point, I was still getting familiar with this character. I still wasn't quite sure who this character was. I'm still not sure, but I have a better sense of who Joe is than I did back when this was written in. Uh, this was probably that first poem was probably written back in about 2009 or something. So yeah, so it was all brand new.
So that first line comes to you, and maybe it was a memory, something you actually experienced. And then, would you say it's kind of like channeling to where maybe we might say that Joe is actually your muse?
Uh, People have said that. uh, yeah, it's I've long subscribed to that I guess romantic view of the poet as channeler, of some kind of muse or some kind of collective unconscious or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
I know that people like Dylan. Uh, they asked him one time, where did those early lyrics and so on from? What was one of the early albums? Blonde on Blonde, that stuff where he first
Yeah.
transitioned into
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
rock, electric.
Yeah. Bringing it all back home. Yeah.
There
Mhm.
you go. Some of the classic early Dylan stuff. They asked him on an interview, where did that stuff come from? He goes, I don't know. I don't know where it came from. And could you do it again? And he said, I don't think so. I don't
Well,
think I.
he would just start playing, just jamming on a piano and in the recording studio, and whole songs would just come to him. I mean, not always. I'm sure there were times that he struggled over it, but when you're in the zone or whatever, it just comes. And the whole mystery for artists, not just poets, the whole mystery is how to stay in that zone frequently enough to kind of stay in the game, because there often are uh, periods of drought or writer's block or whatever that get in the way. But when it's happening, it's a matter of receptivity. When you're receptive, then it all just seems to come together, but the same as what athletes or anyone else talk about. Yeah.
So is it more of when you say receptive, we have the feminine and the masculine. And, it's been typically portrayed as the masculine is the assertive and the feminine is the receptive and the passive. Uh, and I see these lines as they come along, and I think, well, learned it from his shipmate Sinbad. Uh, Well, I certainly don't follow the logical progression of that. So my suspicion is that in writing this, John is in a very receptive mode, and these things are unfolding to you. They're
Yeah,
unfolding from somewhere within the totality of your conscious and subconscious mind.
yeah. And Carl, you talked about the anima, that as you were talking about that female principle that I mean he thought was involved in Otto Rank, who wrote his another disciple of Freud who talked a lot about creativity. Um, that these states are about tapping into perhaps sides of yourself that you're not as aware of, or not that are not necessarily the dominant parts of yourself. So yeah, and I think Joe, people, of course, Joe can be male or female or any combination of, and there are poems about Josephine and Josefa and so forth. But I think beyond that, I think uh, that creative people are always looking to unlock various aspects of themselves, um, and so that's, I think, what goes on here. So some people say, "Oh, you're Joe," and I say, "Joe's the opposite of me in so many ways." I'm sitting here, I'm not roaming the galaxy, right? So in some ways, it's in some ways we do in art what we can't do in real life, or whatever. So alter egos are often our alter as well as egos, right? Um, Back to the lines about, I don't know how it went from being a cowboy to being a seafarer, but again, these are both kind of very romantic occupations, and wandering occupations. And Sir Patrick Spens is one of the oldest poems we know of in the English language. It's an old ballad from around 1,000 years ago. And of course, Sinbad from the Tales of the Arabian Nights, and the Ballad of Skin the Goat. I can just run through it. Ballad of Skin the Goat is a reference in James Joyce's Ulysses. So all these things just kind of clicked, right? But anyway, they all kind of clicked.
Yeah,
Um,
I was saying,
yeah,
this could be a course in literature and history.
yeah.
Some of this stuff, like the ballad of the one about Sir Patrick Spens, I wasn't familiar with that, so I just learned something there. Um,
Yeah, and I think there are some recordings, Paul, by some of the 60s British folk bands, I think, have done versions of it. So I'll have to double check that, whether Pentangle or any of those did. But it's a great poem, and it'd probably be a good song to add to your repertoire. Yeah,
and then we've got the ballad of Skin the Goat. Uh, and I read Joyce, but I certainly didn't retain that.
yeah,
So here we go again. We're moving into another area of literature.
yeah. uh,
Uh,
This poem actually had one of the few poems that I was fact checked on, if I can come clean, because I had him at the end of it. I had him checking his boots for scorpions, which we have around here, and people who are more knowledgeable than I said they don't have scorpions up in Montana. It's too cold for them. so, I
okay,
had,
all right.
so I
Okay.
had to check. So anyway,
And it does fall into, speaking of form, it does fall into that 10-line format that you had indicated was in
yeah.
this book.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it covers a tremendous amount of ground in 10 lines. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that became the challenge, I guess, of the poems, or yeah, or the fun. It's a lot of the fun of the poems for me, anyway.
Well,
Seeing how much you can put into 10 lines without making it stuffy or academic, right? Because you wouldn't want that.
and I've
I
noticed.
like I like to think that the Joe poems could be enjoyed even by children, or that's the goal, that they could be just enjoyed even if you don't know all the references, that you could enjoy them. That's the hope.
And I think they succeed in that respect. Uh, the they can be read at many different levels, and
Yeah,
I can read them and just say, well, I don't know anything about that event or that individual, but I still enjoyed the poem.
yeah. And
I
there's I know you're familiar with a lot of the old Sufi tales, the Nasruddin tales and other Sufi tales, and that was always the goal of those, as with much quote wisdom literature, was to have things that could be uh, understood on different levels, and perhaps enjoyed on different levels. So that
and I'm glad you made that reference. I hadn't thought of that, but Nasruddin, uh, there's a similarity in characters here. Although I would say that Joe is not so much interested in teaching something uh, blatantly like in Nasruddin, where it's,
yeah,
we're teaching you something about reality here, the oddity of it. This is
yeah,
more. He's similar to Nasruddin in certain respects, but far more discursive. I would say far
yeah.
more
But
discursive.
he is kind of the holy fool. I see him as a kind of holy fool in that wider uh, sense.
Well, why don't you pick another one? Let's look at another one.
Okay. Um, well, because you're a musician, I don't read this one very much, but I'll read it. A couple. This is in the same book. Just another early poem. Joe the poet goes a buskin.
Yes,
Uh, and for those of you in the audience who don't know, busking is playing on the streets for money, for spare change. Is that how you would define it, Paul?
certainly. I think that's good. That's succinct
Yeah.
right there.
And of course, it's probably more common in Europe than here in many ways. Okay, Joe the poet goes a buskin. From early morn to the hour the lamplighter makes his rounds, Joe finds a hole in the wall to serenade pilgrims and tourists. Down on Penny Lane, Drury Lane, or along the Raglan Road. Grafton Street, Grass Market, the Old Town of Prague, Frenchman Street, Washington Square, Victory Square, watching for the peelers from beneath blind man's glasses. He'll sell you a poem for a king's copper penny, a broadside for a shiny American dime. But alas, like O Raftery, he's ever a playing music unto empty pockets.
Very good. I mean, that really describes the busking I've seen throughout Europe.
Yeah.
Um,
And of course, I try to make this a little earlier in time with references to the lamplighter and so King's copper penny and so forth. Yeah.
and it leads me to wonder: is busking an old tradition, or is it something that has evolved more recently?
Well, I think it's uh, I mean, I think people have been playing music at, going back to medieval fairs, right? People would come and the farmers would come to the country to sell their wares, and there'd be somebody there playing and trying to make a few bucks. So I would think it would probably be really, really old. The last line is from a famous poem by the Irish poet O'Raftery, who was one of the last of the of the blind bard traveling blind bards, and the kind of the tragedy of them is that in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and actually up until the pretty much up until the Cromwellian invasion of the 17th century, these poets and harpists were uh, were the guests or employees, you might say, of various local lords. So each castle would have its own bard, who was somebody that played the harp, sang, recited poetry, told stories. It was the entertainment, right? The O'Daly family was one of the best known families. These were often family occupations passed down. And in fact, there is still a bard. I saw on the internet. There's actually a bardic school. There was a bardic school in West Cork that somebody's trying to revive that goes back for that. But they had actual schools to learn how to do that and so forth. But then after the British and especially the Cromwellians expelled the local lords or killed them or drove them into exile, the bards had nowhere to go but wander the streets, and a few of them were able, like the famous O'Carolan, the great maybe greatest harpist. He was able to get a job with a Protestant family, and also he was more educated. He was cognizant with European Baroque music and so forth. He made it, but 90% of them were just ending up walking the roads, right? Walking the roads. And O'Raftery talks about playing onto empty pockets, because if you are wandering in the west of Ireland, in County Clare and Kerry, the poorest part, as you know, the poorest part of Ireland back then, you're not going to you're not going to get much money from the audience. So,
Yes.
yeah. But
And
there we go. There's no money in poetry, as they say.
well, I've certainly found that out over the years, but I realized that very early on in life.
Yeah,
Uh, you better get another job because you're never going to support yourself as a poet. And as a
yeah.
musician, my mother wanted me to become a singer
Mhm.
songwriter when I was a teenager.
Yeah,
I thought, I don't know if you're serious about that, but there's no way I'm going to try that because how many Dylans are there in the world?
exactly. Yeah,
I
yeah,
felt like, no, I'd rather get a job where I have a paycheck and I'll
yeah,
play music and write poetry for my own
yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah. Well, you think about the basket houses of Greenwich Village or North Beach, San Francisco, around in the late 1950s and the early 60s, and that meant they were basically open mics where you came in, you sang a song, you played a song, and you left, and then they passed the basket. But you think about the thousands of people that did that took part in those open mics, and we remember the ones who made it. The Roger McGuinn's or the Janis Joplin's or uh, you know uh, the Dylans, but again, 99% of them never made a living at it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and even later, I read yesterday that Joan Jett uh, tried with 20 record labels before she was turned down by 20 record labels before she finally got a contract.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
And when I
Yeah.
think back to whenever I was in high school in Southern California and hearing Jim Morrison on the radio, and it was just like, what? Where is this coming from? Uh, and at that time, there were far fewer bands like Buffalo Springfield. There were only a limited number of bands that were really getting any attention regionally or nationally. And in today's world, commercial world, anybody can record anything at home. And
Mhm.
there's so much material out there. Like I asked John Dunford, Sharon Shannon's manager, you know, John, I don't know how in the hell you took an accordion player and made her famous. You know, it's just miraculous to me that you could take somebody who plays the accordion and doesn't sing. And she's
Oh
an
yeah,
icon in Ireland today, in Australia, and at various other places. But
she's fantastic. Yeah, she's amazing.
she's amazing. But I asked him, you know, one time we were at his brother Stephen's house, who passed away a couple of weeks ago. And we were having some poutine and sitting around and enjoying ourselves, great dinner and drinks. I said, John, how does a how does an artist, a musician, make it these days? How can you get somebody to promote them to to those heights? He said, Paul, I don't know. I don't know how you do it nowadays.
Yeah.
And I think it's a big change from the bards and what was happening then, in the sense that people are sitting in their homes. They may have a job doing something else, and then they're doing this on the side, hoping to make it. Whereas these guys were out on the street trying to get some food.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's a different world, and especially, of course, we just had the COVID closed down for a year and a half. Things are starting to gradually open, but the musicians and other artists were pretty much at home. Where they, and our we have good friends here in Albuquerque that have a duo called Bebe La La, and they did some Zoom concerts over that, and they've just started to do some in person again. And but it was a very rough time, also for the venues like the Outpost, and so yeah.
Now, in two poems here, we've gone from Joe being in Montana, keeping rattlesnakes out of his boots, to busking Penny Lane, Grafton Street, Prague, Washington Square. And that's the span of a few pages here, because it's page 15 where he goes busking, and it was page 13 where he's out in Montana. So I think this kind of is what led to me to characterize him as a cosmic hobo. This guy's all over the place.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So why don't we move on with another Joe poem from the first book?
Okay. Well, since we have the mutual interest in Ireland, I did an MA there back in the 1970s, and I know you visited many times. I'll do Joe the Poet in Ireland, page 39 in the book, and I guess the only um, Thor Lee is a reference to Yeats' home, his castle. He had a castle with a cottage attached to it. It was actually an old tower, an old Norman tower with a cottage attached to it. That's probably the only. And Oisin is a mythical hero, kind of a Rip Van Winkle. He's he goes to the fairy world and he comes back after this a split second. He comes back and everyone he knows has died. And Anyway, Joe the Poet in Ireland. After visiting the grave of Oisin and leaving there 3 hawthorn berries, a tin of smoked salmon, and a penciled poem, and after sleeping 6 nights on the brow of fairy forts and a 7th under Thor Ballylee's parapet, illumined by a midsummer moon, Joe descends to the cool damp of a pub's beer cellar, where he will refuse all food and drink till he composes in the mind's eye 100 necessary lines.
Nice. Now, here we are again. We've moved to Ireland, and we're not only in Ireland, but we're covering various periods of history, uh, mythology, and yet remaining in the present. So what I see happening here is it's kind of like there are no boundaries of time, but there is place.
Yeah, yeah. The time is rather hazy in this poem.
Yeah, it has that tribal type of sanctity that they ascribe to places. Here is a place, and
Yeah.
time just becomes really secondary.
And there are lots of references to Irish mythology, the sacred salmon, sacred hawthorn, that kind of thing. But you don't need any of that, I think, to get the gist of the poem, um, which is again um, uh, again having to do with creating poetry and perhaps the sacrifices or necessary. Here he's fasting, right?
Yes,
Until he gets 100 necessary lines.
yes, right.
And there is there is uh, the there are the reports that the old druid poets, the Fili or whatever, that they would actually go into a cave or underground and do exactly that, fast till they got a poem. And of course, it was all that it was all oral. The poems weren't written down for the most part; they were spoken, memorized. So that's a reference to that. And uh, I should add, I did actually sleep back in 1978. I did actually camp out under Yates across the road from Yates Tower, and it was a bright moon, close to full moon. I got yelled at the next day by the docent. I was just camping in a field, and the docent at the museum yelled at me the next day. But nowadays, you would never be allowed to do anything like that. So, but it was a very haunting experience to look up at that tower and the full moon, and I could almost imagine Yates, walking back, and the ghost of Yates walking back and forth on the top of the tower.
Now, where is that tower, John?
That's in Thorvaldry is in I think it's Gort, County Galway. Oh, yeah, and it's not. It's only a few miles from Cool Park, where his friend Lady Gregory lived, and and it's a little bit south of Sligo, where he was born and so forth. So and buried. So it's a yeah. Um, so it's a rural Galway. Yeah.
Now, I've driven that road many times from Galway up through Sligo
Yeah.
and stopped to visit the grave of the supposed uh, Yates. That
Yeah.
I read that
Yeah.
they recovered his remains in France, and they're not even sure that those are his
Yeah,
remains.
there's controversy there. Yeah, yeah. But yeah. But the nice thing in the 70s, you could go to all those places and nothing was touristy. I mean, nowadays you go to to the Cliffs of Moher or something, and there's guard railings and there's thousands of people, and back then you could kind of wander around, and first of all, there were very few people around, and there were almost no restrictions, which was nice.
Now that you've mentioned tripping back into the past of Ireland, I can remember not into the 70s, but into the 90s, traveling Ireland, and most of it was still the old cottages,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
stone, and they had a certain appearance to them.
Yeah.
They
Hmm.
were very simple. People were
Hmm.
heating with their wood stoves or whatever. They had the hearth, and I can remember traveling and visiting in some of those old style Irish homes.
Yeah.
However, now in traveling, those places are all abandoned. They're empty. You can see children's, rag dolls on the floor, their boots, where people just moved out and left their belongings in the old cottage and
Yeah.
have since constructed these modern homes
Yeah.
that are pretty pretentious, many of them. And,
Yeah.
and it seems like old Ireland just uh, literally was abandoned. Just they just
Well, I mean, I think that the curse of the Celtic tiger, I mean, one can't fault the Irish for wanting to have jobs, and the 1990s and early 2000s, you had a kind of level of prosperity that they'd never seen since the 18th century, and I knew a number of people who were able to come back, who'd come back from England or Finland or Norway, other places, because they could get jobs again. And so, in a lot of ways, it was very good. It also made Ireland a more cosmopolitan place because you had a lot of immigrants from other countries, Eastern Europe and Africa and other places. But the downside of it certainly was that many of the old ways disappeared. You were mentioning the cottages, and not when we were there last time was 3 years ago, and we also saw some of the cottages that had been, you know, refabbed and now were being sold to, foreigners for
oh
incredible amounts of money. So
oh
now, you know, buy your own Irish cottage kind of thing. So yeah, that's the other side of it. But I did want to say another anecdote quickly that I was hiking again late 70s, hiking up on a spring morning up a road near the cliffs of Moher, but inland a little bit. Went by one of these cottages, and an old lady, I was just hiking and, day hiking, and, an old lady just invited me in for tea, which was lovely. And, thatched roof cottages over. I can't see that ever happening these days.
no, it's changed some. I remember once I was driving a road, and I think it was around uh, Kinvara, somewhere in that area.
Yeah.
And I got lost on this road. I kept circling, and I finally decided to pull over where I saw a cottage with an open door. I parked. It was raining as usual, and I went inside, and there was a man standing before the fire, and he had a painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe up on the mantle. And this old man had his back to me. My father had just passed away like a couple of years before. And so I walk in, and he heard me come in, and he turned around. And I looked at him. My father had Irish derivation. And this
Yeah.
man looked at me, and I thought, Jesus Christ, he looks like my father.
Mhm.
And, uh, and he turned to me and he said, sit down, stay. And he
Mm.
was just sitting there watching the smoldering fire with the Virgin of Guadalupe. And my
Wow.
father, when he died, had left a painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the shed where he used to hang out.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I was shocked. I looked at this and I said, this is strange.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
guy said, sit down, stay here and talk to me. But he had the door open to the cottage. And I told him, no, I really can't. I just need to know where I am. And I walked out, and there was a Sufi friend of mine, Mara the Blanco, Victor Blanco's daughter. She was traveling
Yeah.
with me. And I said, Mara, you wouldn't believe what just happened in there. I said, it's just like I ran into my father. And that was way back, that was back in the 90s.
Mhm. Mhm.
When those cottages were still, the doors would be open. People would welcome
Yeah.
you in, like you said.
Mhm.
And the last time I was in Ireland 2 years ago in October, just before the pandemic, I was staying. It was in the Sligo area, but towards the ocean. And I went out for a walk in the morning, and there was an old cottage there, and it was abandoned. And I went inside, and you could see there were children's shoes on the floor. There was the beds stacked
Mm.
in the area where the fire would be kept, and various other articles had just been left. It was just like people
Wow.
moved out, left pots and pans and everything. And I
Oh,
asked
that's
the woman
shocking.
that I was renting a room from, "What about that cottage down the road?" I said, "That could stand to be repaired." And she goes, "The state owns it. The state controls these areas, and
Wow.
they won't allow anybody to rebuild it."
Mm.
But
Mm.
it had fallen somehow under the control of the state.
Mm.
And it was so sad. I felt so sad to just see that the lives that
Yeah.
were there had just been abandoned.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know some of the islands have been forced abandoned by the government, some of the remote islands, because they're basically, it was too expensive to keep a few people, in supplies. So they were removed. Yeah.
Well, here we've gone from Montana to busking to Ireland with a lot to be discussed in each one of these poems. As I was saying, a course in literature and history could be based on these poems. So where are we going next?
Let's go to Peru, page 41. And this is one of the female emanations of Joe. It's Josefina, Josefina, the poet in Peru. And forgive my attempted Spanish here, Paul.
Okay.
Um, Josefina lives solitaire and Simisimado, 10 years on the island of the sun, bathing in sacred streams, drinking spirit vine with shamans, keeping her fire well tended. 30 years hiking cloud forest, jungle depths, Andes peaks. Indians tell tales of machete-wielding woman of the mountains, scaring off poachers and mining surveyors with her fierce song. Arrested for doctoring a wounded guerrilla, stranger in need, she spends 10 years in prison. In that flat place, she sings her mountain songs, converts guards, inmates alike to the subversive path of poesy.
So here we have the translation we have Joe appearing as a female in Peru, a poet.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, parts of this kind of brought to mind Che Guevara whenever he was in his final days there.
Yes, yes. And of course, he was a doctor as well. Yeah. So, yeah. There's also, I think, a reference to the island of the sun that the beat poet Janine Tommy Vega, who I got to know in New York State, she had spent like a year with the indigenous people on the island of the sun. So there's oftentimes I will put in a reference to actual people or several, but yeah.
Now, you mentioned this female poet. What is her name again?
Uh, Josefina. So anytime I create names, they're all based on Joe.
But the female beat poet that you mentioned.
Oh, Janine Pommy Vega. Janine Pommy, Pommy, Vega, Vega. She's an important poet, from the Beat generation, and had uh, lived with Ginsberg and Orlovsky back early on, and good friends with Corso and many of those poets. And she's figured in. I was going to mention later that there's a Brendan Knight's book, anthology book, Women of the Beat Generation has a picture of Janine on the cover in a coffee, the young Janine in a coffee house in like 1960. So that's a really important book because the very few of the, I mean, initially very few women were given the recognition as poets that they deserved, early on. Um, I was fortunate to get to know Janine because she would come by through Western New York. She lived in Woodstock. She would come through Western New York every year, working, teaching in prisons and teaching in migrant camps.
Oh,
And of course, she was the migrant camps in Western New York. Mostly or many are Central American immigrants working in those camps, and there was an arts program through BOCES that she would work for, and of course she spoke fluent Spanish, so that made it easy. Yeah.
so here we're kind of touching on one of the topics that we headlined this with, the beat
Yeah,
poets.
yeah.
I think we've kind of naturally segued into that area. And rather than resisting it, can we go a little bit into your experience with the beat poets at this point?
Yeah, and well, the where to start, as they say. I guess uh, uh, one of the things I like about Joe is that Joe resists categorization, or attempts to resist categorization, classification. And once we start talking about, poetry in terms of schools or movements or styles, then we can get, we tend to get academic, and you put somebody in this category, somebody in that category, and so forth. And it's usually things are much more fluid, right? Is somebody a beat poet? Are they a Black Mountain poet? Are they a New York School poet, and so forth? Are they a San Francisco Renaissance poet? They could be all of those things. It's like if you live in New York and then you move to San Francisco, you could be both, right?
Yes.
And if you have friends who are beats, you might be called a beat poet. And then if you have connections to the Black Mountain tradition, like Margaret Randall, who lives in Albuquerque, who's one of our most famous poets here, and she was actually born in Brooklyn, raised in Albuquerque, and she lived in Mexico City through the 1960s and co-edited an important magazine, El Corno Emplumado, and a literary salon, and knew pretty much all of the Latin American poets and so forth. Then had to flee the government crackdown in 1968, fled to Cuba, lived there for many years, then Nicaragua, tried to come back in the U.S. in I think around 1984. The Reagan administration tried to deport her, even though she was born in America. Uh, and then she's been in Albuquerque for decades. And continues to just publish amazingly, and her own translations of Cuban and other poets, as well as her own poetry. But Margaret, how do you classify? Right? She was in New York City, in Greenwich Village, in the late 50s, associated with a lot of the artists there and some of the beat poets and New York School poets and Black Mountain poets. I she she I said at some point that I thought she was I consider her kind of a Black Mountain poet, even though she was never at that school. Black Mountain was an experimental arts college in North Carolina from the 30s to the 50s, and but a lot of the, I mean, majority of the poets associated with that, and many of the students were from the New York area, right? So it was kind of like summer camp for New York artists, poets, in a way. So she agreed. She thought, she has the influence from that group. But you could call her a beat poet. You could call her, you could call her an international poet. You could call her a Latin American poet. You could call her all, so that's just one example of how poets, I think, defy, good poets anyway, I think, defy easy categorizations, right? So back to, uh, what do all these things come down to? Oftentimes it comes down to who your friends are, because if somebody's doing an anthology, like Donald Allen did in 1960 with the New American Poets, the New American Poetry Anthology, 1960, Grove Press. When someone does an anthology, uh, they tend to group people according to who their friends are, and sometimes that doesn't really work out in terms. I mean, sometimes the friends share a philosophy, share an aesthetic, share, uh, you know, something they're fighting for as artists, but sometimes they're just friends. So it gets complicated. I mean, you could look at, in terms of the beat poets, we have a group that starts out in New York City, and some of them were Columbia students who had dropped out and so forth. Some others were hangers on, like Gregory Corso, who was a street kid, and ex-con who were hangers on. And But essentially it's a group of friends who share, I guess, some kind of an outlook. But then when you look at their work, it's often very different. I mean, Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, first of all, Burroughs mostly a prose writer, Ginsberg mostly a poet, but diametrically opposed in many, many, many ways. But they were friends, so they get grouped together as beats. But what does that mean? We could go through any of these things and say, well, there's certain things that they seem to be rebelling against, or there's certain things that they were promoting. They were all seem to be interested in, or most of them seem to be interested in, hallucinatory substances and exploring, or researching shamanic rituals and this kind of thing. Many of them seem to be, I mean, they seem to all be uh, uh, antithetical to the American advertising, capitalistic um, society of their time, McCarthyism and racism and so forth. Although Ginsberg worked for a while in an advertising industry and learned very well how to promote his poetry and that of his friends. So there's always contradictions, but you could see certain things. I mean, and but then there's often great differences among any of these individuals, and they don't fit into one nice little box. Another thing, of course, the early beats, and then we'll extend that to the San Francisco poets that from 55, 56, there's Ginsberg and others, and Kerouac and others moved out to San Francisco for a while, and there was the famous Six Gallery reading, October 1955, at an art gallery called the Six Gallery. So we extend that then to San Francisco and to other cities. Eventually, it starts up in Albuquerque in the 60s as well. What are they all drawn to? Again, jazz jazz was a kind of um, connection for most of them. Later on, that, I guess, shifts more to rock and roll or folk rock. But in the late 50s, early 60s, it's still jazz that's the defining feature, and jazz that influences their poetry in some respect. Um, uh, but it's hard to pin down exactly. In my own case, I guess back in high school, I encountered the beat poets Ferlinghetti, Ginsberg, especially in high school, and Gary Snyder and others, uh, and um, and poets that came out of that a little bit later, that were influenced by like Richard Brautigan. Um, uh, they were it was poetry that attracted high school students, right? Because it was edgy and it was rebellious, and you weren't, they would take it away from you if the nuns saw it, they would take it away from you, that kind of thing. So that was the initial attraction, I think, for a lot of people, was of course, the subject matter, tended to have sexual and revolutionary themes and so forth. So all those things would be attractive to a kid. When I got to undergrad, I encountered. I was at the University of Connecticut, and I encountered a couple of professors who had been students at Buffalo of Charles Olson, who, after Black Mountain College, he was president of or rector of Black Mountain College when it folded in 1957. Um, he eventually found his way to Buffalo to teach, and then after his wife died in a car crash, he left. He just got up and went back to Gloucester, Massachusetts. But in the late 60s, a couple of his former students, Charles Board, George Butterick, got him a job at the University of Connecticut. He had just died like a year before I got there. So there was this, and they had his archives. There was, again, this ghostly presence that I hadn't met, but I studied him and Robert Creeley, who was his friend, Robert Duncan, Denise Levertov, and then encountered Ed Sanders, Ed Dorn, Diane DePrima, Amiri Baraka, many of those names that were associated with Olson, with that Black Mountain tradition. So that's how I kind of got into it that way. What I liked about Olson was that he was again, he went back like Joe. I mean, he was nothing. He was no Joe the poet. I mean, he was, first of all, he was this towering guy, but his investigations of knowledge were amazing, and he would pull all this stuff from ancient Sumeria, Norse mythology, Irish mythology, everywhere. He was friends with the geographer Carl Sagan. He was corresponding with Norbert Wiener, one of the founders of the cybernetics and computers, and so he's bringing all this stuff into the poetry, and I just found that really fascinating. So I got kind of hooked on that, and I eventually went to Buffalo for grad school in the 80s with Robert Creeley and Jack Clark, who was was a Blakean, but someone who was also very much in this tradition, this Black Mountain tradition, I guess. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying, in my case, how I got hooked into this kind of thing. And but it's hard to categorize because it was all very fluid, and except that all of these poets were in a way defining themselves against what was seen as the establishment poetry of fixed forms, formalism, of poetry that rhymed and was metered and so forth.
Right.
And they were also they also, at least when they were young, they were outside the academy, they were outside the institutions. They were talking about things like anarchism, homosexuality, drugs, all things that were not, peace. A lot of them were peace activists, environmental activists, Michael McClure and Gary Snyder and so forth, were very early on talking very seriously in their poetry about the ecological crisis that most Americans were not aware of, in the late 50s or the 60s. So this was all going on, and what some people would lump it all as a kind of new American poetry or experimental poetry or whatever, was part of a larger counterculture that was developing, that was opposed to the kind of stereotypical Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver world of that America was in the late 50s, early 60s. So yeah, that's I'll pause and let you say something after that ramble. Sorry. That's why I like Joe. 10 lines. You can't ramble in 10 lines.
That did a good job of it brought up a lot of points that I'd like to address.
Sure.
Let's see if I can remember all of them. Maybe I should list them before we go into any one of them.
Okay.
It's the discrepancy between the ideology or philosophy of Ginsberg versus Burroughs. That's one, because Burroughs is still, and I don't know about Ginsberg, but Burroughs is still influencing artists in the music realm through Patti Smith and so on. There's people in their 30s in Ireland and other places who will come back and say, oh, Burroughs, he's really this great figure. And I think, well, Burroughs shot his wife or his girlfriend, and he was really, he came out of a very wealthy family, and he struck me as being a spoiled brat kid who managed to evade consequences in whatever he was doing. I'm not real taken with Burroughs. Ginsberg, on the other hand, who doesn't know Ginsberg who's read any poetry? And to me, Ginsberg is the epitome of a beat poet, yet I see differences between Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti. Very distinct differences. Ferlinghetti seems to be more perceptive and more balanced in his approach to what's going on in the world. And Ferlinghetti just passed away, a year ago?
Yes, at age 100 or something. Yeah.
Age 100. And with Ferlinghetti, I can always have a good laugh at what he's saying. Like he says, I saw the best minds of my generation ruined by poetry readings, by boring poetry readings. Now, that's Ferlinghetti. I don't know that Ginsberg would agree with a statement like that. And Burroughs, I see Burroughs as, I don't see Burroughs in a very positive light. So that's one thing. I'm very curious about the distinctions between Ginsberg and Burroughs.
Yeah. You were talking about musical influences. I also, just as an aside, or that in the 1980s, and Laurie Anderson, did a lot to kind of bring Burroughs back into the picture. Laurie Anderson, who was then married to Lou Reed, that whole kind of New York post-punk avant-garde kind of scene, and many filmmakers, also they all saw Burroughs as and Patti Smith, as you mentioned, they all saw Burroughs as an intrinsic figure in a way that I think he had been kind of, I think he'd been forgotten for a while, or not completely, but he was kind of brought back into the focus then in the 80s. And I think because he fit somehow, his kind of cynicism fit that kind of punk modality, and his one might say obsession with government surveillance and so forth, of the role of language. He said language is a virus, that notion, that way language can be manipulated and and help control us. All of those kind of themes. He wrote a lot of science fiction kind of books that explored those things, Nova Express and so forth. So uh, that kind of darker vision kind of fit the 80s punk kind of thing. Whereas Ginsberg, becomes Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti become models, or elder figures to the hippies, to uh, to a more, I guess, optimistic or more positive. Um, I don't mean positive. Uh, uh, let's just say optimistic view of humanity and more utopian possibility. Whereas Burroughs very dystopian. It's all we're in a trap that we can't get out of, kind of in Burroughs' world, to the extent that I see it. And Ferlinghetti, as you mentioned, especially very early on, was publishing international poets. Was very involved, very interested in Latin America and what was going on. And whereas Ginsberg, yeah, it seems to be a little more insular than that. Although yeah, I mean, he got involved very much in Tibetan Buddhism, Ginsberg, of course. Yeah, but it would take us several hours to discuss it. I mean, Burroughs a prose writer, Ginsberg's a poet, so right away, there's a discrepancy there, and uh, uh, and then Ginsberg comes out of really a family. His father was a school teacher. His mom was a communist activist. Comes out of that left-wing Jewish New York world. Burroughs, I guess grandfather invented the Burroughs adding machine.
Yeah.
He comes out of wealth and privilege. So they're very different. One's a kind of working class sensibility, very different in almost every way, except that they got along as friends. I mean, that's the basis of it. And Burroughs psychoanalyzed Ginsberg as a young man, a young student at Columbia, and helped get him confident or accepting of his own sexuality, of his own homosexuality. So that so you've got you have that kind of basis for a friendship, even though in many ways their worldviews were very, very different. I personally think Burroughs is a genius, as was Ginsberg, but very, very different kinds of people and very different kinds of artists.
Which kind of in an odd way brings us to that French writer, A Season in Hell.
Yeah, Rimbaud. Yeah.
Rimbaud, which I had read when I was a teenager and didn't get anything out of it, and reread after you brought him up and thought, this guy's really incredible. And he quit writing at what, 26 years of age?
Yeah, when it ended up becoming a gun runner in Africa and things like that. Yeah.
But I do see the connection to I see the connection to the later beats. However, it seemed to me that Rimbaud was actually suggesting the opposite of what they took as their anthem or their flag, where he was basically portraying his life as a bohemian, as a season in hell. That's the way I read it. I've been in hell. I want out of this. And his way out was to just abandon poetry and become, like you said, a gun runner. But I read A Season in Hell as being that of a very unhappy young man.
Yeah.
Who did not
well, certainly, I mean, but he has the highs and lows within it. I mean, there's the ecstasy as well as the agony in his portrayals. So I mean, It's which is, I guess, typical of that kind of bohemian, derangement of the senses, that living for the moment, that living for intensity, which is something that all not just the beat poets, but people like uh, like Jim Morrison and Patti Smith and others have taken to heart. So there's got to be, as a kind of um, a kind of bipolar kind of existence, right? So
I kind of see that more in Ginsberg. I don't know that much about Ferlinghetti's personal life, but it's
yeah, Ferlinghetti, no, he was seemed to be a very he'd been an officer in the military, World War II. He was I think he was kind of a devoted family man, not from all accounts not a heavy drug user or drinker or anything. So he seems to be like that steady, that kind of steady person. But he was attracted to Ginsberg and Corso and these other wild characters, interestingly.
Kerouac, on the other hand, disavowed being a beat. I think he blatantly stated, "I am not a beat."
Yeah, I mean, I think he came up with the term which he was talking about. He was thinking of it in, almost Catholic religious terms, beatitude, right? The blessed are, that was what he was thinking about, beats of being open, receptive again to that kind of that spiritual condition, and yet also with that other sense of being beaten down by the system, beaten down by life. So there's that, again, there's a duality, and also the musical beat, the jazz beat, the downbeat, the syncopation. All those things come into that notion of beat that he initially promoted, but he hated being part of. Well, he had trouble with the fame, and he certainly didn't like being packaged in with people that he thought had no connection. Even novels like The Subterraneans, he makes fun of these people with the cool the cool shades and the slick back hair and the whole and the perfect beat outfit. The kind of Michael McClure kind of look, cool beat. He hated that because that wasn't him. He wasn't like that at all. He wasn't, he was not a cool character. He wasn't a cool dude. He was not that. So he didn't like that whole marketing, of the beat image or the beatnik image, which he didn't, you know, he didn't, he wasn't really trying to promote that. Um, he was trying to define his group of friends and what they were into, which was some kind of aspect of spirituality, some, I mean, very much an interest in music, jazz, an interest in a kind of heart-to-heart conversations and honesty. That's what he was talking about with beat. It wasn't the whole beatnik stereotype.
Yeah, and I did read a statement by him where he said, he disavowed it, and he said we were basically traveling around looking for God. That's what we were doing.
Yeah,
We were
yeah,
looking for
yeah,
God.
yeah,
Coming from a Catholic background, I could understand Kerouac for who Kerouac stated he was and what he was doing. But
yeah.
in another sense, I think he was mythologized and commercialized into a James Dean type of character, rebel without a cause.
Exactly. Yeah. And he was a very, very different person than a James Dean, let alone the James Dean characters in those movies. So yeah. So
Well,
I
we're
mean,
coming.
Neil Cassidy, his friend Neil Cassidy, was a lot closer to that to actually being that kind of James Dean figure. I mean, he was a, you know, he was a street hustler, car theft, you know, juvie, and so Cassidy is much more, you know, he's much more of that kind of slick uh, character, but yeah.
Well, we're coming up on the last 10 minutes of this first portion, and I think we've covered a lot of ground here from the first book of Joe, into some of the indistinctions between the Beats and the Black Mountain. I would say that both represent Americana. Just
Yes,
completely
very much.
Americana.
Yeah, very much. And they were, I think they were, you know, they were trying as Emerson, and they're in the Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau tradition, the transcendentalist tradition, in so many ways, right? The transcendentalists who were in the you know 1850s, who are uh, uh, trying to create a new kind of American literature that sets itself apart from Europe, especially from Britain, that sets itself apart uh, from worn out tropes and worn out forms, and also that you know, transcendentalists. They were, well, they were, you know, influenced by European philosophy, German philosophy, but they're, but with them, you know, they were trying to combine it with various kinds of American identities, and to, again, they were searching for God on their own terms, right? So I think there is that longer tradition that you can look at. Although, in fairness, the British Romantics, William Blake especially, is important for a lot of these people, especially for Ginsberg. You know.
And I think those are other areas that I'd like to continue in the second part of this with Blake, and more from the second book of poems. But I think maybe it'd be appropriate if we were to conclude this with another Joe poem from the first book.
Okay. Well, you know, I I'm going to find one that I kind of like in page 36 in the first book, the Joe poems, the continuing saga of Joe the Poet. Oh, I should mention these are both by Foothills Publishing, nice hand-stitched books from Foothills Publishing, which is up in the southern tier of New York, near Bath Corning, down near the Pennsylvania border. And Michael and Carolyn Zanecki have been having this press, this family press, for about 30 years now, and I love their books. Anyway, so this is called Joe the Poet at the World Naval, and it's actually based on an I Ching hexagram number 43. You can look that up.
Wow.
Okay. Joe searches for the chosen spot, place of emergence into his own joyous lake. For 20 years, he walks with forward striving toes, bony thighs, and rain bespattered clothes to show for it. He gets detained by mundane matters for 20 more years, sets out again, renewed of purpose, but fearful lest he's tarried too long, hopes it's still there, hasn't been fracked or paved or blown up in the recent war. 20 more years gone, his steps grown shorter, his eyesight weaker. If he slows down, just a tad more, he'll be right on top of it.
Huh. And that one immediately has reminds me of Stuart Warren. I don't know why. There's something.
Stuart, our late friend Stuart, a wonderful poet here. Yeah.
I could hear Stuart's voice in that poem.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually have a poem that mentions Stuart. I have a Joe and Stuart poem. Mind if I read it if we have time? It's very short. At the end of the second poem.
I read that yesterday.
Stuart died in 2019 of cancer. Sadly, he was the first poet I read with when I first came to New Mexico in 2011, and who actually introduced me to my future wife Jules. So it all comes around. Yeah, Joe meets his old friend Stuart walking Eternity Road. Looks like you have a heavy load, says Joe. It's light as a feather, friend, if your heart is light. That's good to hear, Stuart. Let's walk for a spell. So they walk and they talk and they walk some more, walk down 6 crooked highways and up 9 straight paths. Stuart and Joe explore 7 galaxies and 13 dimensions, walk the 7 bridges road and across the Rainbow Bridge. Then Stuart turns to Joe and says, "This is my turn off. We'll meet again," says Joe, "if the circle be unbroken." So, yeah.
Right. I read that last night.
Thanks for mentioning. Yeah. Not one I read often, but yeah.
And I remember you had mentioned that Stuart introduced you to Jules at Holly's one time.
It was at the Outpost, actually, at a poetry reading at the Outpost. Yeah.
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 Well, God bless Stuart. I really enjoyed his presence. He was an incredible poet.
Yeah. Yeah, we've lost too many recently. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, we're coming right up on an hour and a half here, and I think we've covered a lot of ground here, both with the Joe poems. We did get into the beats and the Black Mountain, and then
next time maybe get a little bit more into the whole. What was the Black Mountain projectivist thing about? We didn't really have time to do today.
I think that'd be a good idea. We can also start off next time, maybe with the second Joe Rides Again.
Yeah, good.
We'll take that one and we'll start with some poems from that, and then we'll make sure that we get into the projectivists and more on Olson and so on.
Good. Sounds good. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been a delight.
Thank you, John. This has really been educational and fun. I will process it and try and get it up within the next day or so on the Duende Facebook LLC site.
Wonderful. Thanks again. All right.
Enjoy your rainy afternoon.
We enjoy rain here.
I can hear the rain coming down, so I'm looking forward to getting out there and standing in it.
Good. All right. Cheers.
We'll see you. Bye.